The automatic doors of Walmart slid open with a faint hiss, letting in the crisp autumn air as an old military veteran, Thomas Grayson, stepped inside. He wasn't a man who liked crowds, but after years in the service, he had learned to blend in, to observe without drawing attention. His sharp eyes scanned the store instinctively, taking in every detail: aisles packed with people, the hum of conversations, the beeping of cash registers. It was just another ordinary evening. Or so it seemed. As Thomas made his way toward the grocery section, his boots tapping lightly against the floor, he noticed something unusual. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, stood near the toy aisle, clutching a small stuffed bear. She had blonde curls and wide, innocent eyes. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention, it was her behavior. She was standing unnaturally still, her body tense as if she were waiting for something. Then, all of a sudden, she turned her head and looked directly at him. She waved. It was a small, hesitant wave, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't the excited, carefree wave of a child greeting a stranger out of curiosity. No, this was different. It was deliberate. Calculated. A silent call for help. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Years of training, years of trusting his instincts, told him that something was off. He had seen that same look before, fear hidden behind a forced smile, a quiet plea for someone to notice. His mind flashed back to distant memories, times when he had to read between the lines to spot danger before it struck. Trying to act natural, he offered the girl a small nod, pretending to go about his business. But he wasn't leaving. Not yet. His gaze flickered around the store, scanning for any sign of what might be wrong. The girl wasn't alone. A man stood a few feet behind her, pretending to browse the shelves. He was dressed in an oversized hoodie, his face half hidden beneath the shadow of a baseball cap. But Thomas wasn't fooled. The man wasn't shopping. His eyes weren't focused on any product. They were on the girl. Thomas's heartbeat slowed, his muscles tightening in preparation. He knew that stance, the way the man's shoulders hunched slightly, the way his fingers twitched. It was the body language of someone who didn't belong, someone trying too hard to act casual. The little girl shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the man before looking back at Thomas. There it was again. That look. That silent plea. Thomas made his decision in an instant. He adjusted the grocery basket in his hand and started moving, not too fast, not too slow, casual but purposeful. As he walked past the girl, he paused just long enough to hear her whisper 2 words that sent a chill down his spine. "Help me." The world around him faded. The distant chatter of shoppers, the music playing over the speakers, it all became background noise. His instincts took over, every fiber of his being screaming that something was terribly wrong. Thomas turned slightly, his eyes locking onto the man behind her. The stranger had noticed. His posture shifted. His grip on the edge of a shelf tightened ever so slightly, as if preparing for something. He knew. For a brief moment, everything stood still. Then, the man moved. And Thomas reacted. Thomas didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind had fully processed the situation. He stepped closer, closing the distance between himself and the little girl, placing himself between her and the man in the hoodie. The stranger froze for half a second, just long enough for Thomas to catch the tension in his body, the slight shift of his weight, as if he was deciding whether to run or fight. The girl clung to the stuffed bear in her hands, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Thomas could feel her fear radiating off her, but he kept his expression neutral. Years of training had taught him that sometimes, the most dangerous situations weren't the ones where people yelled or made a scene, it was the ones where everything stayed quiet. He turned slightly, pretending to scan the shelves, but he kept the man in his peripheral vision. The guy had that look, the kind Thomas had seen overseas in bad places, someone trying to blend in, someone with a reason to stay unnoticed. Thomas had spent a lifetime reading people, and everything about this man screamed wrong. The man shifted, eyes darting to the store's entrance, then back to the little girl. His jaw tensed. A decision was being made. Then, he turned and started walking away. Thomas exhaled slowly, but he wasn't relieved. If anything, this made things worse. If the guy had gotten aggressive, if he had made a move, Thomas would have known exactly what to do. But slipping away? That meant he wasn't just some random guy loitering. It meant he had a plan, and now he was adjusting it. The little girl tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. Thomas crouched down slightly, keeping his voice calm. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Maddie." "Maddie, are you here with your parents?" Her lower lip trembled. She shook her head. Thomas clenched his jaw, anger flickering beneath the surface. He had seen too much in his lifetime to ignore that answer. A little girl in a Walmart, alone, being watched by a man who had no reason to be there. It wasn't a coincidence. He glanced toward the front of the store, scanning for security. There were only a couple of workers near the checkout lanes, busy ringing up customers. No one else had noticed anything. People were wrapped up in their own worlds, unaware that something terrible might be unfolding right in front of them. Thomas looked back at Maddie. "Did you come here with that man?" Tears welled up in her eyes. She shook her head again. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "Do you know him?" She hesitated for a second too long. I don't know." That answer was enough. Thomas stood up, scanning the aisles. The man in the hoodie was nowhere in sight, but that didn't mean he was gone. He could be watching from another section, waiting. He could be outside. Or worse, he could have an accomplice. "Okay, Maddie," Thomas said gently. "I need you to stay with me, all right? We're going to find someone who can help." She nodded, gripping her bear even tighter. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't want to make a big scene, not yet, but he also wasn't about to let Maddie out of his sight. He glanced around, making sure no one suspicious was lurking. Then, just as he was about to dial 911, something caught his eye, movement, near the entrance. The man was back. This time, he wasn't alone. A second figure had appeared, standing near the automatic doors. A woman, dark sunglasses perched on her nose, her arms crossed over her chest. She wasn't shopping. She wasn't browsing. She was waiting. Thomas recognized the setup immediately. He had seen it before, in places he wished he could forget. This wasn't random. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Maddie hadn't just wandered into the wrong aisle at the wrong time. She was being hunted. Thomas turned slightly, blocking Maddie from view as he adjusted his grip on his phone. He knew he had only seconds to act. The man and woman were watching him now, their body language shifting. They had realized he wasn't just another bystander. They knew he had picked up on something. And now, they had to decide what to do about it. Maddie whimpered quietly. "They're still here." "I see them," Thomas said, keeping his voice low. "Listen to me carefully. We're going to walk toward the front, okay? Just stay close." Maddie nodded quickly, her tiny fingers gripping the sleeve of his jacket. Thomas started moving, his mind running through possibilities. He could alert store security, but there was no guarantee they'd act fast enough. He could try to get to the parking lot, but that would expose them. He needed a controlled environment. Somewhere with people, but also somewhere safe. They walked past the checkout lanes, toward the customer service counter. Employees stood behind the desk, chatting with customers. It was the safest place in sight. As they reached the counter, Thomas leaned in slightly. "I need you to call the police," he said, his voice low but firm. "Right now." The employee, a young man barely out of his teens, blinked in confusion. What?" "There's a little girl with me." "She's in danger," Thomas said, glancing back. "And the people who want her back are standing at the entrance." The young man paled. He looked past Thomas, toward the doors, then back at him. He must have seen something in Thomas's expression, because he didn't ask any more questions. He reached for the phone. Maddie pressed closer to Thomas, her breathing shaky. "Are they coming?" she whispered. Thomas didn't look. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. Instead, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Not if I can help it." The employee spoke quickly into the phone, his voice shaking slightly. A moment later, he nodded. "They're on their way." Thomas exhaled, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. Not yet. The man in the hoodie was gone again. But the woman in sunglasses? She was still there. And this time, she wasn't alone. Another figure had joined her. Thomas's stomach tightened. This wasn't over. Not even close. Thomas didn't move. His body tensed, instincts flaring, every muscle ready to react. The man in the hoodie held his gaze for a beat longer, then flicked his eyes toward Maddie. It was subtle, almost like a taunt, like he was letting Thomas know that he wasn't giving up so easily. Maddie's grip on Thomas's sleeve tightened. He could feel her small fingers trembling, but she didn't make a sound. She was scared, but she was smart. She knew this wasn't over. The young employee behind the counter shifted nervously, glancing between Thomas and the approaching man. Should I do something?" he muttered under his breath. "Stay on the phone with the cops," Thomas replied, barely moving his lips. "Tell them there are at least 4 of them. Maybe more." The kid's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He nodded quickly and turned his attention back to the call. The man in the hoodie took another step forward. He was too confident. Too sure of himself. That meant one of 2 things: either he was armed, or he had backup closer than Thomas realized. Thomas shifted slightly, angling his body just enough to shield Maddie. He kept his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that fear could be smelled just as easily as blood in the water. And if this guy thought he had the upper hand, Thomas wasn't about to let him believe that for long. A quiet voice broke the tense silence. "Please," Maddie whispered. "I don't want to go with them." Thomas's stomach twisted. She knew them. Maybe not all of them, but at least one. And that made things even worse. The man in the hoodie smiled. It was small, just the barest twitch of his lips, but it made Thomas's skin crawl. "Come on, kid," the man murmured. "You know you shouldn't talk to strangers." Thomas clenched his fists. He wanted to hit this guy. Every instinct in his body screamed to act. But he forced himself to stay still, to wait. Because right now, they weren't just fighting strength against strength. This was a battle of patience, of who would break first. Maddie buried her face into Thomas's side, her small body pressing into him like she knew he was the only thing keeping her safe. The man in the hoodie took another slow step forward. "We don't want any trouble," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "She just wandered off. We're here to take her home." Thomas let out a slow breath. He had heard a lot of lies in his life. That one wasn't even a good one. "Is that right?" Thomas said evenly. The man nodded. "Yeah. Just a misunderstanding." Thomas's lips twitched. "Then why didn't she run to you when she saw you?" For the first time, the man hesitated. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Thomas caught it. Then, just as quickly, the guy covered it up with a chuckle. "Kids get scared." Thomas kept his face unreadable. "They do." He could feel Maddie shaking against him. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. That told him everything he needed to know. Behind the man in the hoodie, the woman in sunglasses was shifting her stance. The man in the dark jacket was watching closely. The guy in the baseball cap had disappeared, which meant he was likely circling around. They were tightening their net. Thomas's heart pounded, but he kept his body loose, ready. He needed to get Maddie out of here, but he also needed to make sure they didn't try to take her before he had the chance. A new voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Is there a problem?" Thomas turned slightly, just enough to see a Walmart security guard approaching. He was tall but lanky, probably in his mid-50s, with tired eyes that suggested he had seen his fair share of shoplifters, but nothing like this. The man in the hoodie's expression barely flickered. "No problem at all," he said smoothly. "Just picking up my niece." Maddie made a small sound, a whimper, barely audible, but it was enough. Thomas squared his shoulders. "She's not going anywhere with him." The security guard frowned. He looked at Maddie, then at the man in the hoodie. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You got any proof of that, sir?" The man's jaw tightened. Thomas took the opportunity. "Call the police," he said, voice low but firm. "They're already on their way. This isn't a simple mix-up." The security guard hesitated. He wasn't sure who to believe. But then Maddie finally found her voice. "He's lying," she whispered, voice small but clear. "I don't know them." The guard's hand immediately went to his radio. "I'm calling this in." And just like that, everything changed. The man in the hoodie's entire demeanor shifted. His muscles tensed, his stance changed. He wasn't playing anymore. Thomas saw it a second before it happened. The guy moved. Fast. But Thomas was faster. With one sharp step forward, he blocked the man's path, keeping Maddie behind him. The man froze just as Thomas's voice dropped into something cold, something dangerous. "You don't want to do this." The man in the hoodie clenched his jaw. His hands twitched at his sides. Then, the woman in sunglasses muttered something under her breath. And just like that, the entire group backed off. The man in the hoodie lifted his hands in a mock surrender, taking a step back. All right," he said, voice smooth again. "We're leaving." Thomas didn't move. He didn't trust it. But sure enough, they turned. One by one, they walked toward the entrance. Before they reached the doors, the woman in sunglasses paused. She glanced over her shoulder, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "This isn't over," she murmured. Then they were gone. Thomas let out a slow breath, his pulse still hammering. The security guard was already speaking into his radio, calling for backup, but Thomas knew one thing for sure. They would be back. And next time, they wouldn't walk away so easily. Thomas kept his stance firm even after the group disappeared beyond the automatic doors. His pulse was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he forced himself to stay still, to keep his mind sharp. Maddie clung to his side, her breath quick and uneven. She wasn't crying, but she was close. He could feel the way her small body trembled, and that was enough to send another wave of anger through him. The security guard was still on the radio, glancing between Thomas and the entrance, his expression uneasy. "Yeah, they just left," he said into the receiver. "But I don't like it. They'll be back." Thomas didn't need to hear the conversation to know that much. The woman's parting words weren't just a threat, they were a promise. People like that didn't walk away because they were scared. They walked away because they were waiting for a better opportunity. The employee behind the counter, the one who had made the call earlier, was still standing there, his face pale. "Dude," he breathed. That was intense. Thomas ignored him. He crouched down so he was eye level with Maddie, keeping his voice calm even though every muscle in his body was still locked and high alert. "Do you know who they are?" She hesitated, her wide eyes darting toward the doors. "Not really," she whispered. "But I think I've seen the woman before." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Where?" Maddie bit her lip. "I don't know. I just remember her face. She was talking to my mom once. I think." That was enough to send warning bells ringing in his head. He glanced toward the entrance again. The parking lot was visible through the large glass windows, but there was no sign of the group. They hadn't left. Not really. They were still out there, somewhere, waiting. The security guard lowered his radio. "Cops are still 5 minutes out," he said grimly. "They'll be looking for the suspects, but something tells me those people are gonna be long gone before they show up." Thomas knew that too. And 5 minutes could be an eternity when dealing with people like this. He exhaled slowly, looking back at Maddie. "Where's your mom now?" She hesitated again, then lowered her gaze. "I don't know." His stomach twisted. That was not the answer he wanted to hear. Maddie peeked up at him, her fingers still clutching his sleeve. I wasn't supposed to be here alone. Mom told me to wait in the car, but I got bored, and I thought if I just went in real quick." Thomas didn't let her finish. "You did the right thing coming inside," he said firmly. "Don't ever blame yourself for that." She nodded quickly, but she still looked scared. The security guard let out a sigh and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, we can have you both wait in the office until the police get here. Probably safer than standing out here in the open." Thomas considered it. On one hand, getting Maddie out of the main area was a smart move. But on the other hand, he scanned the parking lot again. A car engine rumbled in the distance. A black SUV was idling near the farthest exit, just barely visible behind a row of parked cars. It wasn't moving. Just waiting. His instincts screamed at him. They weren't gone. They were still watching. Thomas's jaw clenched. "No," he said. "We're not staying here." The guard blinked. "What?" "But they're still out there." Thomas kept his voice low. "And they're not going to sit around forever. If the police don't find them first, they'll make another move." Maddie swallowed hard. The young employee behind the counter looked even paler. "Dude, you think they're gonna try again?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He looked at Maddie again, his mind racing. "Where do you live?" She hesitated. "Not far." He nodded, making a decision. "All right. I'm getting you home." The security guard frowned. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "No," Thomas admitted. "But it's the best one I've got." Because standing here, waiting for the cops to maybe catch those people, wasn't an option. He needed to move now. He needed to get Maddie somewhere safe before they got another chance to take her. The security guard hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "All right. I'll walk you to your car." Thomas shook his head. "We're not using my car." The guard's eyebrows shot up. "Why not?" Thomas kept his eyes on the SUV in the distance. "Because if they're watching us, they already know what I'm driving." He turned back to the employee. "You got a back exit?" The kid blinked. Yeah. In the stockroom. Leads to the loading dock." Thomas gave a quick nod. "We're going that way." The security guard opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. He let out another sigh and muttered, "I hope you know what you're doing." Thomas didn't respond. Because truthfully, he wasn't sure if he did. All he knew was that he had to get Maddie out of here before it was too late. He gently took her hand and squeezed it. "Stay close," he murmured. She nodded, gripping his hand tightly. And then, without another word, they moved. Thomas kept his steps steady as he led Maddie through the back of the store. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a dim glow over the towering stacks of inventory. The employee walked ahead of them, glancing back nervously as they moved toward the exit. Maddie's grip on Thomas's hand was tight, her small fingers curled so firmly around his that he could feel her pulse racing. She hadn't spoken since they'd started moving, and he could tell she was trying her best to be brave. But she was still just a kid. A kid who had almost been taken. The security guard followed closely behind, his radio crackling with updates from the front of the store. "Cops just pulled in," he muttered. "They're looking around the parking lot." Thomas nodded, but his gut told him it was too late for that. The people after Maddie weren't stupid. They wouldn't have stuck around once the police showed up. They were watching from somewhere else now, waiting. They reached the metal door leading to the loading dock. The employee hesitated before pushing it open. "You sure about this, man?" Thomas didn't answer. He just reached for the handle himself and cracked the door open an inch, scanning the alleyway outside. It was quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the occasional rustling of trash in the nearby dumpsters. No movement. No shadows shifting unnaturally. But that didn't mean it was safe. He turned back to Maddie. "We're gonna move fast. Stay close to me, no matter what." She nodded quickly, eyes wide. Thomas exhaled and pushed the door fully open. Cold air rushed in, but he didn't stop to feel it. He stepped outside first, keeping Maddie tucked close to his side, his eyes scanning every direction. The loading dock stretched out ahead of them, leading to a side street where only a few parked cars sat under flickering streetlights. He moved quickly, guiding Maddie toward a row of vehicles. He didn't have a plan beyond getting as much distance from the store as possible before their pursuers figured out where they'd gone. Then, just as they reached the end of the alley, a car engine roared to life. Thomas yanked Maddie to a stop, pressing her behind a stack of crates. His pulse hammered in his ears. Headlights flared on, sweeping across the alley as the black SUV from before pulled out of the shadows. They had been waiting. Thomas's stomach dropped. They hadn't fallen for the police distraction at all. They had anticipated this. Maddie's breath hitched. She gripped his sleeve, eyes locked on the vehicle as it inched forward, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed Maddie and bolted. They cut down the side of the alley, slipping into the narrow gap between buildings. The SUV's tires screeched as it accelerated, trying to cut them off at the next block. Thomas's mind raced. He needed to lose them, but every move he made, they were anticipating. They weren't just chasing him randomly, they knew what they were doing. This wasn't their first time hunting someone. Maddie stumbled slightly, and Thomas caught her before she could fall. "Almost there," he whispered, though he had no idea where there even was. Then, just as they turned a corner, another figure stepped out from the shadows. Thomas skidded to a stop, his instincts flaring before his brain could catch up. The woman in sunglasses. Except she wasn't wearing sunglasses anymore. Her sharp eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, she smiled. "You put up more of a fight than I expected," she said, voice calm, almost amused. "But this is where it ends." Maddie whimpered, pressing closer to Thomas. The woman took a step forward, tilting her head slightly. "Give her to us, and this doesn't have to get messy." Thomas's mind spun. He knew one thing for certain. They weren't walking away from this without a fight. Thomas tightened his grip on Maddie's hand, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The woman's calm smile sent every alarm in his mind screaming. She wasn't bluffing. She had expected this moment, and she was prepared. The black SUV pulled up at the alley's entrance, its tires grinding against the pavement. Two men stepped out, their movements slow, methodical. They were closing in. Thomas took a step back, shielding Maddie with his body. He needed to think fast. Running was no longer an option. They were surrounded. The woman took another step forward. "You're not leaving with her," she said simply. "You're a smart man. You know that." Thomas's jaw clenched. He wasn't about to just hand Maddie over. Not when every instinct told him she was in danger. Then, without warning, Maddie moved. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled something out, a small, silver keychain with a button in the center. Her fingers trembled as she pressed it. For a second, nothing happened. Then a piercing alarm blared through the alley, so loud it echoed off the brick walls. The woman flinched, her composure breaking for the first time. One of the men cursed, jerking back as the sound rattled through the air. Thomas didn't waste the moment. He grabbed a metal trash can beside him and heaved it toward the woman. She stumbled, barely dodging it as it crashed to the ground with a loud clang. The two men hesitated just long enough for Thomas to act. He swung Maddie into his arms and bolted. The alarm was still wailing, loud enough to attract attention. Lights flickered on in nearby buildings. A dog started barking somewhere in the distance. Thomas sprinted toward the nearest open street, not daring to look back. He could hear them cursing behind him, could hear the SUV's engine revving up again, but he kept running. Then, tires screeched. A second set of headlights flooded the street. But this time, it wasn't the black SUV. It was a police cruiser. The officers had arrived. The SUV's brakes squealed as it jerked to a stop. The woman and her men hesitated, their cover blown. Sirens blared, flashing red and blue across the alley walls. Thomas didn't stop. He ran straight for the officers, Maddie still clutched tightly in his arms. The second they reached the police, she burst into sobs, burying her face in his chest. One of the officers stepped forward, looking from Thomas to Maddie with wide eyes. "What the hell is going on here?" Thomas barely had the breath to answer. "They were trying to take her." The officer's expression hardened. He turned toward the SUV just as it peeled away, tires screeching against the pavement. Another cruiser sped after it, chasing them into the night. Maddie was still shaking against Thomas, her small hands gripping his jacket like a lifeline. He held her close, feeling his own adrenaline start to crash. The officers quickly ushered them to safety, asking questions, trying to piece together the situation. And then, as everything finally started to settle, Maddie whispered something against his chest. "I know why they wanted me." Thomas pulled back, looking down at her. "What?" She sniffled, wiping at her tear-streaked face. "That woman, she wasn't just talking to my mom before. She was following her." Thomas's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, one of the officers spoke. "Sir, we just got word, Maddie's mother has been reported missing." Everything inside Thomas went still. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Thomas felt a sharp chill run through him as the officer's words sank in. Maddie's mother was missing. He glanced down at the little girl in his arms, her face still streaked with tears, her small fingers clutching his jacket tightly. She wasn't just scared, she knew something. And whatever it was, those people had been willing to risk everything to take her. The officers guided them to the squad car, away from the flashing lights and murmuring crowd that had gathered near the alley. One of them knelt beside Maddie, his voice soft. "Maddie, sweetie, do you remember the last time you saw your mom?" Maddie sniffled, rubbing her nose with her sleeve. "At home, before we went to the store. She was on the phone." She sounded mad. Thomas frowned. "Did you hear what she was saying?" Maddie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "She said something about a deal. That she wasn't gonna let them take it. And then she told me to stay close to her no matter what." Her lower lip trembled. "But I wasn't close enough, was I?" Thomas's heart clenched. This little girl was blaming herself. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Hey, this isn't your fault. You did everything right, Maddie. We're gonna find your mom, okay?" The officer beside them exchanged a glance with his partner. "We're putting out an alert now. If she's in danger, we'll find her." But Thomas knew how these things worked. People like the ones they had just faced didn't leave loose ends. And if Maddie's mom was involved in something dangerous, she might not have much time left. The next few hours were a blur of questions, reports, and radio chatter. The police did their best to reassure Maddie, offering her a blanket and a cup of hot chocolate from a nearby diner. Thomas stayed close, unwilling to leave her side. He had no legal connection to this child, no reason to be so involved. But something in his gut told him that walking away wasn't an option. Then, just as dawn started to break, an officer walked in with a grim expression. "We found her." Maddie perked up instantly. "Mom?" The officer nodded. "She was found a few miles from here. Alive, but shaken up." He glanced at Thomas. "She's asking for her daughter, and for you." Thomas didn't question it. Within minutes, he and Maddie were in the back of another squad car, racing toward the hospital where her mother had been taken. Maddie was gripping his hand so tightly that it almost hurt, but he didn't let go. When they arrived, Maddie practically leaped from the car, dashing through the sliding doors. Thomas followed close behind, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the woman sitting in a hospital bed, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her dark hair was disheveled, a bruise forming on her cheek, but the moment she saw Maddie, her entire face lit up. "Maddie!" The little girl ran straight into her arms, sobbing into her chest. Her mother clutched her tightly, whispering soothing words into her hair. Thomas exhaled, relief washing over him. But as he stepped closer, Maddie's mother lifted her gaze to his, and in her eyes, he saw something beyond gratitude. She knew. She waited until Maddie had settled before speaking. "You saved her." Thomas shook his head. "She saved herself. She's smart. Brave." Maddie's mother swallowed hard, her hands still trembling slightly. "I didn't know who else to trust. I still don't. But I need to tell someone the truth." She took a deep breath. "Those people, they were after me." Thomas had suspected as much, but hearing her say it confirmed everything. "I used to work in finance," she explained. "Nothing major. Just processing paperwork for big companies. But I found something I wasn't supposed to." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Money moving in places it shouldn't. Names that didn't match records. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I got a message, a warning to stop asking questions." She shook her head. "I ignored it. And then, things started happening. My car was broken into. My emails got wiped. And then, today, they came after Maddie." Thomas's stomach twisted. He had dealt with bad people before, but this was on another level. "Do the police know?" She nodded. "I told them everything. They're investigating now. But people like that, they don't leave trails. I don't know if the law can protect us." Thomas met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Then I will." Her eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to." "I do," Thomas interrupted. "Because I was there when it happened. Because Maddie looked at me and trusted me to keep her safe. And because people like that don't just stop." His jaw clenched. "They need to know they messed with the wrong people." Maddie's mother exhaled shakily, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you." Over the next few days, the investigation moved fast. The black SUV was found abandoned outside the city, wiped clean of prints. The woman in sunglasses had vanished, along with her men. But the financial records Maddie's mother had discovered were now in police hands, and authorities were working to unravel the tangled web of corruption. Through it all, Thomas stayed close. He helped Maddie and her mother relocate to a safe place while the case unfolded. He made sure Maddie laughed when she started to look scared again. And when she finally smiled without fear, he knew he had done the right thing. Then, one morning, as he walked Maddie to school, she slipped her hand into his. "Are you gonna stay?" Thomas looked down at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "For as long as you need me, kid." Maddie grinned. "Good." As they reached the school gates, Thomas felt something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. And as Maddie waved at him one last time before running inside, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a chance encounter at Walmart. It was the start of something bigger.